Hi, thank you all for coming. Welcome to Brown Bag Lit. We're really happy to see you here. I'm Chloe Elena Miller, the co-founder of Brown Bag Lit, along with Shasta Grant. We host classes, events, and we're home to Lunch Break Writers, a writing accountability group that meets on Wednesdays at noon Eastern Time. The Lunch Break Writers program is a membership that includes special events. For example, next week, we're hosting Teresa Okafgadon, I'm not sure I said her name correctly, for our book club author craft talk, which should be really great. You can find more information about our programming on our website, brownbaglit.com. I'll put all the information into the chat. We hope to see you next month for our May program, Writing the Hybrid, the boths and betweens of poetry and prose with Ellen Glenn Moore and Miranda Schmidt. And you can find previous event recordings on our YouTube channel. And again, I'll put the links in the chat. So we're really excited to share today's event with you, Love on the Page, Transforming Passion into Words, with Laura Zam and Liza Achilles. And so we encourage you to purchase our authors' books, follow them on social media. Throughout the session, you're welcome to put questions directly into the chat while the authors are speaking. And afterwards, we'll have a Q&A, and you can raise your hand and ask your question or put it into the chat. Please note that we are recording this event. Please stay mute while the authors are speaking. And I will turn it over to Laura. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's so great to be here. Thank you, Chloe and Shasta and Liza. Great to present with you. Okay, I'm going to dive in about my book, The Pleasure Plan, and then subsequent stuff. So I had a lot of sex problems. That's where all of this begins. I had all these problems. I was vaguely aware of them. I knew they got in the way of my very troubled relationships. And I didn't know what to do with them. But then I got married for the first time at 46 and wanting to solve these problems to basically save my marriage, but also so that I would know pleasure for the first time in my life. I went on a, well, first I wanted to do this, but I didn't know what to do. And then I got a play commission. I was working in the theater at the time, and my specialty was one-person plays. And so I decided that I would use this play commission to solve my sex problems. I would use this, the structure of an art project to somehow help me because I just didn't know what my issues were. I didn't know if it was related to trauma, which I had a history of trauma. I just didn't know even how to begin. But I did know how to structure an art project. And so when I got the play commission, I said, okay, I'm going to just turn the whole thing into an art project. I'm going to structure a healing journey and I'm going to heal in real time, meaning I was going to use the time that they gave me to create the play to investigate different kinds of healing opportunities. And so this went on for about 6 months. And then I had a play at the end of it, which at first was caused some rift in my marriage, which we can talk about after. But anyway, the play was there, the play was presented, but obviously I couldn't solve 30 years of problems in 6 months. So I continued on the journey, but I needed some sort of aesthetic container for it. So I decided that I was going to turn this material into a book. And so I basically just continued on my healing journey, but I had in mind that this was going to be a book, and I was actively seeking a book deal that I could sell on proposal. Since I had the baseline of this play, I started publishing essays about sexual healing, and eventually I did get a book deal. And at that point, I had been on this healing journey for about 5 years, And then when my book came out, and I actually did cure myself this way because I learned so much about female sexuality, about marriage, about relationships, about trauma recovery. I just studied everything there was to know. And that's the book, The Pleasure Plan, which came out um, in 2020. And I also, during this time, became angry. During this whole time, I was angry about the lack of information there was for somebody to solve sexual problems. It took me 5 years, for instance, 5 years to find out that a huge part of what was going on, an exacerbation of existing problems, was due to perimenopause. And I know now people are talking a lot about perimenopause, but at the time there was nothing in the stratosphere, nothing about painful sex, how to have a sex positive approach to trauma recovery. All of these things were really hidden. Anyway, so I became a sexuality educator. I went through a very elaborate program to become certified so that I could work with other people. And I started working with women on their own sexual challenges as a sexuality educator, sexual solutions coach. And then my husband became very ill. And I realized that I needed my own teachings related to the bedroom. I needed to apply them to my life outside the bedroom. I needed to adapt these for my own resilience. And so I started to develop to basically like rejig all that I knew about pleasure and connect it to resilience. And um, and then I started working on a new book, and that book is working title is called Steep, and that book is me visiting one fabulous and unique tea house in each of the 50 states. And in so doing, I'm during these visits, I am investigating different aspects of pleasure and resilience. I'm currently writing the book. I'm up to 20 tea houses now. I started doing keynotes. I do a lot of public speaking now, talking to people about resilience, especially right now, as times are very, very troubled, helping people personally and also societally. So I'll stop there, but that's where I am and where I'm evolving in terms of my ideas about art projects as a way to help a person heal or even just process ongoing healing. And yeah, and the utility, I guess, of memoir or writing more generally.
Great. Thank you, Laura. I guess I'll jump in. I want to thank Brown Bag Lit for having me on. So thank you, Chloe and Shasta and Laura. It's great to be presenting with you. So I am Liza Achilles, and my book is Two Novembers, a memoir of love and sex in sonnets. I started this book because of a real life thing that happened to me. I fell in love with my physical therapist, true story. And this happened sort of simultaneously as my marriage was ending, and also simultaneously as I was finishing writing a novel that I had worked on for more than a decade. And I kind of decided that it wasn't going anywhere. I couldn't find a publisher or an agent, and it was my first writing effort, and I decided to just put it aside. So I didn't have a current writing project, and I had fallen in love in a kind of a taboo way, right? Like I didn't necessarily want to tell any of my friends that I had a huge major crush on my physical therapist. It sounded kind of cliche and just kind of like, I don't know, silly. So I didn't tell anyone. And when my husband and I separated, the first thing I did was I sat down at my computer and I just felt like I need to write my physical therapist a poem because I need to get this out. But I had never really written a poem before because, as I said, I was a novelist, or I was trying to be a novelist. And I remembered that my favorite book in the whole world is Shakespeare's Sonnets. So I thought, well, I'll write him a sonnet, right? So I reminded myself of what a sonnet is. It's 14 lines. It has a rhyme scheme where every other line tends to rhyme until the very last two lines, and the last two lines are the couplet that rhyme. And it's got a very specific rhythm to it. It's called iambic pentameter, as I'm sure you all know. And that sounds like this, da 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 da. 5 iams. An iam is da da. So once I had refreshed my memory about that, it became sort of a puzzle. Like, how do I express my feelings in this very strict format? So I wrote the poem that first day, and I thought that was going to be it. And then the next day I woke up and I had more feelings to express. So I wrote another poem. And this kept happening until I realized, oh, wait, I think I'm writing a book. So at that point, I decided that I would go ahead and write for a whole year. And during that year, I didn't know what would happen, but as it turned out, you know, my love life changed. Some interesting things happened with the physical therapist. I did some, you know, online dating, you know, met another guy, and like various things happened. And it does have like a good ending, which was sort of serendipitous that it happened that way during the course of that year. I will tell you, if you read my book, it does go in order. So a lot of people like to read poetry by skipping around, which is great. But for my book, that doesn't work as well because it is actually a story that goes from beginning to end. I think at this point I was going to read a couple poems, but should I throw it over to Laura? Were you going to do a reading as well? No? Okay. Then I will. I was going to read you sonnets 114 and 115. 114 sort of ties into the theme of this event today, which is sort of like, how do we like deal with everything that's going on in the political sphere right now? And one of the big things I talk about in my book is just like, how does feminism play into the dating world? And how does that relate to all the messages we're given by the media about, you know, romance and you know, how are we supposed to be in a heterosexual relationship as a woman? So this is sort of a feminist poem. Sonnet 114. All's fair in love, but only if she's strong. I don't see how a tapped down passive me could lead to mutual respect. It's wrong and frankly gross to weave a tapestry of weft without a warp or vice versa, then try to use those loose and separate threads to warm a couple's nights. The media for centuries have told us that our beds should be enwrapped in thick, huge, manly cords that pin her so all she can do is glance in silent awe at what true love affords when mates equality swap for romance. Where's he who'll weave, if not you, absent strands, with tension matching mine, with humble hands? And then I go on in sonnet 115 because I felt like, well, that was true, but it wasn't quite completely right because yes, I want equality, but at the same time, men and women aren't exactly the same. So here's sonnet 115. My dear loose ends, to clarify my stance, I don't think men and women are the same. While culture dictates part of circumstance, our genomes, too, locked down who we became. You watch and play team sports and care who won. Most everything inside my purse is pink. I think clothes shopping is bedazzling fun. You're great at spurring moving parts to sync. What's due to culture, what to personal quirks, and what to sex type? All I know's when we pursue each other ardently, that works. Though we do go about things differently. You boys seek sex and love. We girls, I fear, seek love and sex. Wait, what's the problem here? And I'll stop there. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you both. That was really great. So we are open for questions. You can raise your little yellow Zoom hand if you like, put a question into the chat. I would love to start with a question thinking about privacy and how much freedom you offer to the folks that you're writing about your partners, and if you what kind of guidelines you allowed for that. Laura, would you like to start?
Yeah. So I was writing about my sex life with a current partner. It was tricky. It was very, very tricky. I when I alluded to the fact that there was a conflict when I did the play. So my husband was on board for my healing and knew about the play, and I didn't have him read the play though in what was more of a final form, because I was always revising radically up to the last minute. And so we didn't read a final version of it. And then I had a public reading of my play, and he felt humiliated, in his words, to be quite honest. And we had to process this, and he agreed that I could, and the play it didn't go very well. That draft was not great. So I uh I got his consent to revise it. He wanted me to change his name, and also we got just deeper into our own private healing and parameters about what was private and what could be made public. And I was more participatory in bringing him along. And then when I finally got a book deal, well, first of all, I became more public about what I was doing on the road to a book deal, because I was publishing essays and using his name, and he was okay with it. I think a lot of that was that he was more comfortable with this healing journey and saw it more as something that we were on together. But I was just better at having him vet all the material. I also had was writing about practitioners that I saw. I saw 15 different kinds of practitioners. I tried 30 different healing modalities. And so I sent those chapters off to the people that I wrote about in my book to make sure that they felt that they were fairly represented or accurately represented in the book. I did change identifying details, and everyone consented, but one person, that a tantrika that I saw, she said that she didn't feel that that was really her, but she wished me luck and didn't prevent me from publishing anything. So now that I'm writing about my husband's illness, I'll have to go through a separate process. Right now, I'm just putting it all down on the paper raw, but I will have to vet this with my husband and probably with his daughters as well, just to make sure that there are no surprises and that everyone is comfortable with what I reveal publicly.
If I can ask a follow-up question, Laura, when you say vet, like thinking of the writers in the room, are you offering the folks who are reading it the full opportunity to make any changes, or kind of how do you hold the boundaries?
Yeah, I think it would be all around privacy, around my husband's health issues. So I, aside from that, I wouldn't be seeking any kind of input. But I think that this privacy issue could very well be something that comes up. And I'm also, as a way of softening the personal information related to somebody else's health challenge, my husband's, I'm also writing about my father. Um, and so, and my father was also chronically ill. And so it gives me a little bit of leeway, because I feel that if I run into discontent about what I'm revealing with my husband, I can fill that in with backstory or with my father. So it's a bit tricky. It will be a bit tricky. Right now, I'm just, like I said, I'm putting down what I need to put down. I'm a caretaker, like I said, with somebody who's very ill. And so I need this for my own mental health, really, for my own sanity. And so, but what I make public will need to, most probably will need to be adjusted with that input.
Thank you. I love the intersection of healing and privacy and craft, that you're able to kind of use the various stories in different ways. Thank you. Liza?
Yeah, it's a really hard thing when you're writing memoir. And even though my book is a book of poetry, the word memoir is on the cover. I do have the standard disclaimer about, memoir being, this book is it is a true, it reflects my true recollections, right? So everything in the book is true, but I also changed some identifying details. Now, there are two men who are sort of like principal, I guess, characters who play a very large role in the book. One of them was my physical therapist, and I did make him aware that I was writing the book and seeking publication for it. And I did let him read the final draft before I gave the go-ahead to the publishing company. And I got very fortunate that he was okay with it. And he was happy with the changes that I had made to mask his identity. And I think that, frankly, he was flattered. So it helps that, I was being complimentary. And so that was cool. And then with the second guy, who's sort of a principal in my book, he was like so flattered that he was like, oh yeah, you don't have to mask anything, which was great because I didn't have to go back and change those poems at all. I just left them as is. So that was awesome. Then there were a couple men that I had went on a couple dates with who I also masked their identities, but I did not tell them, couple random dates, they might, even if they read the book, which they probably won't, they probably wouldn't even recognize themselves. The biggest issue for me was my ex-husband, and I do have a few poems that sort of allude to an unhappy marriage. And I even talked to an attorney about it. And, I'm not an attorney, so don't quote me on this, but my attorney definitely talked about, well, there's sort of like libel. Libel's the one that's written, right? I keep forgetting that. And so you can get around that as long as you're telling the truth. But then there's also invasion of privacy. So if somebody has, I don't know, like HIV or something, and you disclose that, or if somebody has, they had an abusive childhood and you disclose, that's their story, right? You're not allowed to tell their story. That would be an invasion of privacy. But my attorney said, I have a right to tell my story, which is, if he said something mean to me, if I want to, I can tell that story. So I had to really think about, how much do I want to say about this? And, I really believe in memoir. I wouldn't be writing memoir if I didn't believe that it has value in the world. And I know that as a person, I've grown so much from reading other people's memoirs and just seeing that, oh my gosh, like bad things have happened to other people, and abusive things have happened to other people, and that's not right. And when you see it, in somebody else's life, it's easier to identify, oh, that's abuse or whatever it is, right? And then you can more easily apply it to yourself. So I felt like it's important to tell these stories. And I also masked the identity of my husband, ex-husband, to the extent that I could. I mean, obviously there's a ton of people in the world who know who he is, and I can't change that, but I did change as many characteristics as I possibly could to protect him to the extent possible. And I did not ask his permission, although I'm writing another book, which is autofiction. It's going to be a novel that's very similar to a memoir, and it's about my life. And for that one, I'm sort of thinking about, even though I'm going to try to mask as much as I can about him, maybe I would sort of just reach out to him and just say, hey, FYI, you know, just as a mark of courtesy. But I'll cross that bridge when I get to it.
Thank you. I think it's really brave to offer, one might say, the power to others to read the work and then respect their responses and think about how to keep their privacy versus, as you said, Liza, keep being able to tell your own story. Caroline, I see you.
Can I
Oh,
add
go
something
ahead.
just on that? And then we can get to Caroline's question, which is an awesome one. So as I mentioned, I'm in addition to writing about my husband and my father, who's now deceased, I'm writing about 51 tea houses, which means 51 tea house owners. And so to me now, I'm realizing that there's a kind of a spin, or there's another facet to this whole question about writing memoir, right? Revealing people's identities and their own privacy and all the things. And that is the extent to which our writing might benefit, in some cases, might benefit other people who are featured in our book. And going a step further, how those people might have a vested interest and might help our book as it goes out into the world. So I think that there's just something else that I'm really pondering these days, the extent to which ideally our books don't just belong to us, that they belong to the world, and we want people to be invested in whatever way, but especially if people are featured in the book, maybe they might help that book find its audience.
Yeah, and Laura, in the end of your book, you have so many great resources, and you do, I assume some of the names of some of the therapists are true, and folks could follow them and find them and kind of benefit their businesses as well.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Liza, you started to answer this, but Caroline, would you like to read your question aloud?
Oh, I think you're on mute.
Yes, you are. If you can unmute Caroline. Let's see if I can. All right, Caroline. We can't hear you yet.
I'm sorry.
There you go.
But my key question, I'll just get to it, is when do you decide to go from memoir to fiction, especially to autofiction? Because I've written autofiction and I'm sort of writing the series of, I'm writing these series of short fictions right now, and I'm leaning into the fiction realm, even saying that, but it could be memoir if I wanted to approach it that way. So how, particularly Liza, you sort of now said you're going into a novel. I mean, why take on the novel, whether it's autofiction or not, versus stay with memoir? Because it seems like you're in that sort of middle ground too, or that divide, on that line.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. I love that. And Caroline, by the way, I've been wanting to meet you in real life because I've heard about your publishing house and I'm just curious about it. So that's cool. So yeah, to answer your question, with the poetry, I was writing the poems as everything was happening in real life. So I was very much able to focus on the exact details because I could remember them. When I went to work on my current book that I'm working on, I actually wrote it originally as a memoir. So my first draft is in memoir form. But what I found was I just couldn't remember all the details. And so then it became a choice of, do I make up the details and call it a memoir? Or do I just make up the details and call it autofiction? And I didn't want to, I didn't feel like I could do justice to my story without sort of painting a better picture and having more dialogue. And, there was a woman who published a book recently who just got absolutely trashed online. People saying, oh, there's no way you could have remembered all of that from your childhood. It was the woman who wrote about, she said that she had a mental disorder where she didn't have empathy. I can't remember the name of the book. Maybe you guys remember that book. But I just thought, you know, that we now are fortunate enough in our society to have this category called autofiction. And what I found was when I gave myself the freedom to write fictionally, in a weird way, I was actually able to be more truthful to the sort of the story that I was trying to tell, instead of trying to be truthful to my, you know, lacking memory, if that makes sense.
No, it does. And that's exactly sort of where I am. You know, so I keep going back and forth. I have to sort of decide what it is. But thank you. Thank you. I look forward to looking at your books. And thank you, Chloe, for putting that Washington Writers Publishing House. This is not a, I'm here as my own person.
Oh, no, that's fine. I just remember you were talking about it at another Brown Bag Lit event that I was at. So.
Yes, yes. I'm very proud. I'm the co-president, everybody, of the Washington Writers Publishing House. We publish writers from DC, Maryland, and Virginia, and open for manuscripts May 1st. That's the commercial. Thank you, Chloe.
Laura, did you think about fictionalizing? Or if you could, I'm really curious for both of you to talk a little bit about how you differentiate between the genres, with the play, Laura, and the essays, and the memoir, and then Liza with the fiction and the poems, because there's obviously so much overlap, right? The dialogue in the memoir, and then Liza's got a story arc that we don't always see in a poetry collection. Laura, if you'd like to start.
Yeah, I used to only, when I was working in the theater, all my plays were fiction. I never considered writing any kind of autobiographical material. I did that for decades. And then in 2007, I wrote a play about visiting the sites where my mother lived during World War II. My mother was a Holocaust survivor who survived, unfortunately, we can say maybe the worst of the war. Well, the worst would be, you know, extermination. But my mother was in concentration camps and ghettos. My mother was in Auschwitz. And so I wanted to visit these sites, and it didn't make sense to do this in a fictional way, because these things had really happened. And I wanted to tell her real story. And in addition to that, because I was writing about story and trauma and basically the legacy of inheriting very painful stories, I included just a tiny little bit about my childhood sexual abuse, which didn't involve any family members, because I wanted my own street cred in terms of my own trauma story, independent of this. And I noticed that when I presented this play, which I toured around quite a bit, a lot of people would come up to me and they would say I was also sexually abused. Or they would want to talk about, oh, my grandfather was in the camps, this kind of thing. And it was really a revelation for me to have that kind of connection with people and their real stories around my real story. And so I kind of just flipped at that point and said, this is what I want to do. Actually, my next play was a combination of fiction and nonfiction. I appeared, it was a one-person play. I played a fictitious motivational speaker, but I appeared as myself, as a person attending this fictitious motivational speakers event. So I switched it, but I was also curious about how, you know, how this might work. But by the time I got around to writing about my sex problems, I definitely didn't want to make this fictional, because I wanted to put this out in a real way, a real way, and raise awareness around these issues. And I wanted people to talk to me about their own struggles, especially once I kind of also transitioned into this, a different kind of career. Now I was more of like a nonfiction person. There's like a whole career path or even a business model of the nonfiction person. Often it's self-help, but this person does some sort of education and they do some sort of publishing and they do public speaking. And I was moving into that realm, and I moved into that realm. And so in that realm, fiction doesn't quite make sense. And now that I'm writing about these tea houses, they're existing tea houses, and I want to raise awareness about these tea houses, as I said before. So it's not really an option. Also, in terms of the privacy, if I created autofiction around my husband's illness, people would have even more questions, and I feel like it would be even more problematic. And so I just feel like I'm, strangely enough, on firmer ground, just talking about real stuff, but maybe revealing a little bit less of or a little bit more, based on other people involved and what their response is.
So in response to the question, I just want to say I love blended genres. And whenever I think about that, I always think about a quote that I'd always attributed to Jared Diamond, but then when I looked back in the book where I thought Jared Diamond had written it, I couldn't find it. So then I was like, well, maybe it wasn't him, or maybe it was in a different of his books. But I think it was Jared Diamond who said that all of the most fascinating research is at sort of the intersection of two different fields, right? And so, of course, like in his work, he's sort of blending all sorts of stuff like history and archaeology and like ornithology and all sorts of different stuff. So I always love it when there's like a genre bending book or genre blending, I should say, book. And something really fascinating happened to me recently, which is, I had the poetry book, and then I was thinking about my next book. And so I started calling myself a literary autobiographical author. And I felt like I was sort of creating a new genre by, taking memoir and poetry and fiction and, making different mashups of those. And then I started to think, well, how can I tie this in with my original novel, which is unpublished? And honestly, now that I've it was kind of like my practice book, right? Now that I've learned how to be a writer, I think I would like to one day go back to that old novel and rewrite it. And I just thought, well, that novel was historical. How does that fit into my autobiographical place that I've sort of found myself in? And suddenly it occurred to me, oh my gosh, that is maybe the key to making that old novel work, is to add autobiographical elements. Because the period of history that I chose was the 1587 Lost Colony. And I ended up having two main characters. One was an Elizabethan female who sailed over to the New World from England. And then I had a Native American male. And, I did just enormous amounts of research about these two different cultures at this specific time period, and sort of the meshing of the cultures and the religions. And then I was adding in gender in there. But what I kept running across is like the whole own voices movement. Like, as a white person, do I have a right to write a Native American story? And so I wonder, and this is just sort of an idea that maybe I will use and maybe I won't one day, but maybe that sort of like question about the whole own voices movement is something that I can put into the novel. Anyway, that's my response.
No, I really like that question. Thank you. Okay, so we've talked about kind of healing, finding the story within, the narrative arc, respecting those who are involved. And we titled this Writing Passion. So let's think kind of more directly about writing sex and the body, and choices that you might have thought about in how to create those scenes, presenting, yourself in these autobiographical moments about the body and kind of the inner workings and not just the emotional relationships with the folks. How does one write that? Who would like to begin? Laura looks ready.
Yeah, sure. So I was writing about sexual issues, which is a little bit, it's related, but a little bit different than writing about sex per se, because I wasn't trying to make the scenes erotic. I was trying to convey as honestly as I could problems that arise on a moment-to-moment basis, and the awkwardness, and pain, and even kind of technical kind of technical things that are going on, with a kind of, I guess, an agenda to write about, to expose these things, to help other people not feel so alone if their sexual experiences are not like in the movies. And so I really doubled down on that. And there are scenes later in the book that are more erotic, but I didn't really, I wasn't trying to turn on the writer. I didn't have any of that in my mind. It was more about, just trying to convey what it felt like to have things flow, for instance, to have things work, to surprisingly have the body respond. And so I, in a way, I think it taught me, if I wanted to maybe write a romance novel, let's say one day, it taught me something about, I think, just trying to capture things as truthfully as possible. The moment to moment of physical intimacy is very, very fascinating to me. Part of what I do as a sexuality educator is I teach consent and even empowerment, pleasure empowerment on college campuses. And I teach people how to advocate for themselves, women particularly, how to advocate for themselves on a moment-to-moment basis. And I feel that I can't get enough of anything that's going to show me what to do, and how how you can really maybe take the reins back if things are going beautifully, and then somebody, puts a hand somewhere, and all of a sudden it's like, ow, or ooh, or something. How do you turn that around? So I guess I'm just I think I I'm more interested in those questions, I guess, sexually, or conveying that experience sexually, than I am maybe something else that might be sexier.
I think that the intimacy of those scenes with the kind of emotional connection, but also the awareness of your physical body, is almost more intimate than kind of a traditional sex scene that really kind of turns both inward and outward at the same moment with awareness of the outside. I like what you said about agenda. I think that's really interesting, of thinking about which aspects to focus on to show that moment. Thank you. Liza?
Yeah, I think that my book arose out of several factors. Like, one is, my mom grew up Catholic, and the religion is notorious for, suppressing sort of ideas about sexuality. And so I think she was always really uncomfortable, um, when I was growing up, with sort of talking to me about sexuality. And she's had her own journey of growth over the years, and I had my own journey of growth. I think it was that. I think it was, when I fell for my physical therapist, it was a different kind of feeling than I had ever had before. And I was almost like shocked, it was like, oh, that's what Shakespeare was talking about in his, Sonnet 18 or whatever. Although who knows what Shakespeare is actually talking about, because he, it's a very unusual set of sonnets that he wrote. But it's almost like, oh, that's what everybody's talking about in the love songs that I'm hearing on the radio. You know what I mean? And so I was just kind of shocked that it took me that long. I was in my, I guess, late 30s when I finally like experienced it for the first time. And um I felt like I wanted to sort of express what that was. But at the same time, I also felt that in our society, uh, because of like the history of men being the ones to usually be writing the great books, or any books, we're always getting the perspective of the male, right? The male gaze. And I thought, well, can we have a female gaze, right? Can I be like gazing at my physical therapist? Like, is that okay? And you know, a, a friend of mine a friend of mine recently bought my book, and he came up to me at a book club the other day, and he was like, oh, I wasn't expecting so much spice. And he had this look on his face like what did I just get into with reading this book? And yeah, and I think that my book is having that effect on a lot of people, because it's just not it's not as much seen in our society that you're going to talk like a woman talking explicitly about the male body, but it seems like we see it everywhere, men talking explicitly about the female body. So all of that was happening. And then also, I told you that I did a lot of research about Native American culture, and I read that in a lot of, obviously there's so many different tribes and they're all different, but I was mainly reading about, some of the tribes on the eastern seaboard, and a lot of them were very open. And maybe this is true for most tribes as well. I just don't want to speak for all tribes, but a lot of the ones that I was researching were extremely open about sexuality, and it wasn't like a big deal. Like in our culture, it's always like, oh, like, am I allowed to, use these certain words? And the words that you're not allowed to say on TV and on the radio, most of them have to do with sex. And it's just such a big taboo, and I kind of don't want it to be a big taboo. I don't know why we can't just talk about stuff. So that's why I decided to write so frankly.
Excellent. And we readers appreciate the frankness and getting to know ourselves and all the possibilities. Which then leads me to a bigger question, as we have been in a time of opening and freedoms and learning more and more about the female body and being able to study it and know what we can do for our own health and pleasure. As we enter into a new phase of America, what kinds of things are you both thinking about in terms of your writing regarding frankness and or making choices that might be different to have your books perhaps not be banned or be allowed to be fully spread and discussed openly? Whoever would like to start.
I guess I feel that I have things I want to say, and those things are important to be said. And I feel like, you know, ideally, if your book is banned, you'll get even more readers in some places, maybe. Um, I think we have to fight. I think we shouldn't give up. I think that even among all the, the liberal publishing industry, it's very much about how to make money and sell books. And when people write about taboo topics, it's maybe not the best way to sell a book. But I know that I personally, again, I go back to like, I personally have benefited from those taboo books in my life. And we need to speak truth. And I think that every writer has to make their own decisions about what they're trying to accomplish. And definitely, absolutely no shade on anyone who wants to write a book and be a bestseller and make a ton of money. I think that's amazing, right? And a lot of people write escapist, books, and people have hard lives and they come home from their, terrible job and they read their fantasy novel, and I think that's amazing, and we need that in our world. But we also need like sort of like books that are truth telling. And I guess I decided I was going to try to be one of those people. And if I'm fortunate enough to succeed and, you know, become popular, and then somebody wants to ban my book or put me in jail, then, you know, I'll have to think about leaving the country if it comes to that with, you know, our current administration. But I don't think that we we should base our careers off of, you know, the fear, I guess.
Thank you. Laura?
Yeah, I think things are changing on a daily basis. And so I don't want to have whatever I feel called to do dictated in that way. But at the same time, I do want to respond to the moment. Like I said, I'm because of my own personal experience in my own family, I really have felt called to write about resilience. And then Trump was elected. And so I'm like, oh, resilience. Yeah, this could be, maybe this is something that might meet the moment. And so I am thinking about that because I do public speaking. I am thinking, okay, who are the audiences for that now? For instance, I'm putting together a talk and want to reach out to people who were laid off from the federal workforce and get an invitation to them and tailor the talk to them. And I'm thinking about the T book addressing that as well, addressing the division, because I'm traveling around the whole country. I'm like, okay, what about the division in our country? It has to work itself into the book, but to what extent, and what do I want to really talk about here? I don't want to bring together people from the political spectrum together with me in the tea houses. It's not that, but what is it exactly? So I'm always very interested in the zeitgeist and interested as an artist in somehow responding to it, being a part of it in some way, so that I don't feel like personally I have my head in the sand. But as I started out saying, I also don't want to feel that I'm hiding, or that I'm self-censoring, or that I'm giving in to censorship. So it's all a dance. It's a daily dance right now.
It is. Thank you. We have a few more minutes. Since there are no more questions, I was wondering if each of you could give your favorite kind of tried and true editing advice, what it is that you do when you sit down with the editing mind in order to kind of craft your piece. It might be specific to a particular genre or not, but kind of your final encouragement to us as writers finishing projects.
And you're referring to editing our own work?
Your own work, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm gonna let Laura go first while I take a drink of water.
Okay, sure. I can do that. So I was working on one of my chapters yesterday, and I felt sleepy, and but I was also working on the shape of the chapter. And then I've done this in the past, but not quite as intentionally. Um, I'm a big structure person, so I would say that my number one advice is to go in, when you're doing an edit, to go in where you feel most comfortable, or feel like you've got the most skill, or maybe it's intuition about what works and what doesn't. That gut response, I feel, is really critical. And for me, it's foremost structure, and then I fill in the lines. But yesterday I was thinking, this nap could really be helpful as well. Like, kind of just um, go in initially, and then just take a nap. Let the pressure go, and just let it kind of sift down, get into the bones, get into a place that's not uh, so overly intellectualizing, and then go back in and refine that, and then add in the different things that might be where you're maybe don't feel you have as much facility. Details or something I really have to like go in, and sensory details, and like very intentionally put those in the body of, you know, the characters, what's going on physically. It's not what comes to me first. So anyway, that's my that's my editing process with an emphasis on the nap.
I love it. I can't speak intelligently about it, but a friend is studying psychology and she's specifically studying the importance of daydreaming for creatives and what our mind does kind of without us structuring it as we do for other parts of our work. Thank you. Liza?
Yeah, I'm gonna second the nap for sure. Or just like go to bed and wake up the next morning. I think anything that you can do to sort of get out of your own head is what you need, because you've read that stupid sentence how many hundreds of times, and you don't have an accurate perspective on what it is to read it for the first time, like your reader is going to. So I sometimes I use tricks like I change the font size or I change the font, or I stand up and look at it instead of sitting down and looking at it. It's like anything I can do to change like how I'm like looking at the words to make it seem like I'm reading it for the first time, I find helpful. The other thing that I don't think my poems would have been published if I hadn't tried to publish individual poems in literary magazines, because what I found was like some of my favorite poems weren't the ones that were being published, and some of the ones that I didn't necessarily like quite as well were getting published, and I was like, wait a minute. I'm noticing why they're choosing these poems, and I'm starting to realize what's higher quality about those. And even though I had like a little place in my heart for this other poem, you know, maybe it wasn't up to standards, right? And so then I used that feedback to help me um, edit the remainder of the poems that weren't published.
I like the idea of changing the font. I always try and print it out or handwrite it and look at it in different ways, but we can also keep it on the computer. Thank you all so much for coming, for sharing your ideas of your expertise, your experiences.